The night Ira Donovan won the Donnelly Ranch in a poker game. The last thing he expected was for the land to come with a woman who looked at him like he was the most inconvenient thing the good Lord had ever placed upon this earth. It was the autumn of 1876, and the town of Cutter's Creek, Nevada, smelled the same as it always had of horses and whiskey, coal smoke and desperation. But on this particular Thursday night, the Silver Spur Saloon carried an additional scent of ruin, because Cecil Donnelly had been drinking since noon and making bets since sundown, and the pile of promissory notes in the center of the table had grown tall enough to cast a shadow. Ira Donovan was not the sort of man who sat in saloons for pleasure. He was 28 years old, broad across the shoulders from years of fence mending and cattle driving, with dark eyes that absorbed everything in a room before he committed to entering it. He had ridden into Cutter's Creek 3 days prior with $40 in his coat pocket, a horse named Columbus, and absolutely no plan beyond finding work before winter drove itself into the valley like a fist through a window. He had sat down at the poker table that night because a man named Hector Beale had invited him, and because $40 felt lonelier in a man's pocket the longer he went, without spending any of it on something that felt alive. He had not intended to be good at cards. He had not intended to be good at reading Cecil Donnelly, who pressed his mouth together when he had a poor hand and breath through his nose when he had a strong one, and who had been breathing through his nose with increasing irregularity as the whiskey took hold. Ira had simply paid attention, the way he always paid attention, and the chips had accumulated in front of him with quiet, embarrassing efficiency. By 10 o'clock, Cecil Donnelly had lost $300 in cash, his best mare, and his dignity in roughly equal measure. He was sweating through the collar of his shirt, and his eyes had the wet, reckless shine of a man who has decided that the only way out of a hole is to dig deeper. "I'll put in the land," Cecil said, and the whole table went quiet in that particular way saloons go quiet when someone says something irreversible. Hector Beale set down his cards. 2 other men cleared their throats. Ira looked at Cecil Donnelly across the table and measured the man's desperation the same way he measured everything carefully, without sentiment, with the particular attention he gave to things that mattered. "What land?" Ira asked. "The Donnelly Ranch, 412 acres north of town. Good water, solid house, barn that won't fall in winter." Cecil's jaw tightened. "I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I've lost my mind." "I'm thinking you've lost a great deal already tonight," Ira said quietly. "Then let me win it back." Cecil slapped a deed down on the table with the authority of a man who had stopped thinking entirely. "One more hand." Everything on the table against the deed. Ira looked at the deed. He looked at the man. He thought about $40 in his coat pocket and a Nevada winter coming in like a wall of iron, and he thought about Columbus standing in the livery stable eating grain he had paid for with the last of his careful savings. "All right," Ira said. He won on a full house, 3 jacks and 2 nines. Cecil Donnelly stared at the cards for a long, terrible moment, then stood up from the table, knocked over his whiskey glass, and walked out of the Silver Spur without saying another word. The men around the table were very quiet. Someone bought Ira a drink he hadn't asked for. He held it in his hand for a long time before he set it down untouched, folded the deed carefully into the breast pocket of his coat, and walked out into the cold Nevada night to think about what he had just done. He rode out to the Donnelly Ranch the following morning, because the deed was real and the land was real, and he supposed he ought to have a look at what he had won before the reality of it dissolved into something less solid. The ride north of town took 40 minutes along a road that climbed gently through sage and juniper, and when the house came into view, it was better than he had expected. A proper 2-story structure with a wide porch and a stone chimney sending a thin column of smoke into the pale October sky. He had not expected the smoke. He reined Columbus to a stop at the gate and studied the house with the careful attention of a man who has learned that smoke means people and people are complicated. There was a vegetable garden along the south wall, mostly harvested but still standing with the brown stalks of what had been a serious summer's labor. There was a chicken coop and a well in a barn in good repair. There was a dog asleep on the porch steps. There was also, as it turned out, Augusta Donnelly. She came around the corner of the house with a bucket of water in each hand, and an expression on her face that suggested she had been hauling water all morning, and intended to haul it for some time to come. And she stopped when she saw him standing at the gate the way a person stops when they walk into a door in the dark, with complete surprise and immediate irritation. She was, he observed, approximately 24 or 25 years old, with dark red hair pinned severely at the back of her neck and green eyes that went sharp the instant they landed on him. She was wearing a practical dress in faded blue with a canvas apron over it, and she had mud on her boots and a smear of something on her left cheek that might have been grease or might have been soil, and she was looking at him with the focused hostility of a woman who has spent considerable time cultivating the skill. "Who are you?" she said. She did not set down the buckets. "My name is Ira Donovan." He took off his hat, which was the kind of thing a man did when he was trying to appear less threatening and wasn't sure it would work. "I'm looking for Cecil Donnelly. My father isn't here." Her voice was even. "He didn't come home last night." Ira absorbed this. "Miss Donnelly, it's Augusta," she said, as if correcting him were the only satisfactory use of her energy at the moment. "Augusta," he said, and something happened when he said her name, some small shift in the atmosphere between them that neither of them acknowledged. "I have some business to discuss with you regarding the property. Perhaps when your father returns." "My father," Augusta said, "has been gone since yesterday afternoon, and the last time he went to the Silver Spur with that look on his face. He was gone for 4 days and came back without the cow he'd taken to market." She finally set down one of the buckets and straightened her spine with the deliberate dignity of a woman who has had quite enough of this particular kind of mourning. "Whatever business you have, you can say it to me." Ira stood there in the morning light with the deed in his breast pocket and the full weight of what he had done pressing down on him in a way it hadn't in the saloon the night before, when everything had been cards and chips and the comfortable distance of a game. This was not a game. This was a woman standing in front of her home with mud on her boots and an expression that dared him to say something she would not like. He took a breath. He was not a coward, and he was not a liar. "Your father lost this property last night in a poker game," he said. "He put up the deed as his stake and he lost the hand. I hold the deed." He paused. "I wrote out because I thought it was better to come in person than to send a letter." The silence that followed was the particular kind of silence that comes before something significant. Augusta Donnelly looked at him for a long, measuring moment. The color had not left her face. If anything, she had gone paler and then flushed, in quick succession, like weather moving across a landscape. The dog on the porch lifted its head, looked at Ira and went back to sleep, which Ira found privately reassuring in the way that animals' reactions to people often were. "Show me," she said. He showed her. He handed the deed across the gate fence and she took it with steady hands and read it thoroughly, which he respected, because a lesser person would have either refused to look or thrown it back at him without reading, and she did neither. She read every line. She turned the paper over. She looked at her father's signature. Then she handed it back. "He didn't have the right," she said, and her voice was very controlled. "Half this land belongs to my mother's estate. She died 4 years ago and the property was never fully settled in probate. He can't have signed away what isn't entirely his." Ira looked at her. Then he looked at the deed. Then he looked back at her. "Is that true?" he asked. "I'll get you the papers," she said, and walked into the house without another word, leaving the second bucket of water sitting in the yard. She came back 12 minutes later, he counted. From some instinct he couldn't entirely explain, with a folded document that had the official marks of a Nevada territorial court upon it, and she was right. The probate on Helena Donnelly's estate had been opened in 1872 and never formally closed, which meant that a portion of the land was technically in limbo, neither entirely Cecil's to dispose of nor entirely settled into any other arrangement. It was, as legal matters went, a spectacular mess. He stood at the gate and read the document she had handed him, and he was aware of her watching him with the careful, assessing attention of a woman who was determining whether he was going to be reasonable or whether she was going to have to find another way to fight. "I'll need to speak to a lawyer," he said finally. "There's one in town, Ambrose Carr. He's not entirely useless." "All right." He handed the document back to her. "I won't do anything with this property until we've sorted out what part of it can actually be disposed of legally." Something moved in her expression, not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it, as though she had prepared for a different argument than the one she was getting. "You're not going to simply claim the whole thing and tell me to take it up with a judge." "I won one hand of cards," Ira said. "I didn't win the right to throw a woman off land that half belongs to her dead mother." The silence stretched between them again, warmer this time, though neither of them would have described it that way. "The coffee is on," Augusta said at last. "If you want to come in and sit down, I can show you the rest of the paperwork." He tied Columbus to the gate post and followed her into the house, and it was everything the outside of it had suggested, clean and solid, with the kind of quiet order that comes from a person maintaining a space entirely by themselves for a long time. There were photographs on the mantel and braided rugs on the floor, and a good cast-iron stove in the kitchen from which the coffee smell came, rich and real and grounding in a way that the whole strange morning had not been. She poured him coffee without asking how he liked it, and set a plate of biscuits on the table between them with the brisk efficiency of a woman who feeds people as a practical matter rather than a social one. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, and she spread out the paperwork her father had accumulated over the years, deeds and letters and court documents and tax records, and they spent 2 hours going through all of it together, her explaining what she knew and him listening with the genuine, thorough attention that was his most reliable quality. What emerged from those 2 hours was this. Cecil Donnelly had owned 312 acres outright and had shared stewardship of the remaining 100 with his late wife's estate. He had not, in his card-playing recklessness, specified which portion he was wagering. He had, in the words of Ambrose Carr, who they would visit the following week together, created a legal situation that was going to require some thought. What also emerged from those 2 hours, in the space between documents and coffee cups and the occasional punctuation of the dog scratching at the door to be let in, was a picture of Augusta Donnelly that was considerably more complex than a woman with mud on her boots. She had kept the ranch's books for 4 years. She had managed the cattle sales, negotiated with the feed supplier in town, hired and dismissed the 2 hands who had worked the property before the money ran out. She knew the land with the intimacy of someone who had walked every acre of it in every season, and she spoke about it with a quiet, contained love that was more revealing than she probably intended. He also learned, in the way you learn things when you are paying attention rather than planning what to say next, that she was 24 years old, that she had never been to school past the age of 12, but had educated herself methodically from every book she could find, that she had not left Cutter's Creek in 3 years, and that she and her father had not been on what she would call comfortable terms since approximately the month her mother died. Cecil Donnelly, when he finally returned to the ranch 2 days later, was not sober and was not apologetic, and was not, in Ira's estimation, a man who had ever paid sufficient attention to the remarkable person he had raised. He was a broad, red-faced man of 55 who had the look of someone who had once been physically capable and had spent the intervening years turning that capability into something blurred and stubborn. He looked at Ira sitting at his kitchen table and then looked at Augusta and said, "Well, I see you've made yourself comfortable." And Augusta said, "Sit down, Papa," in the tone of a woman who has been managing a difficult situation for a very long time. The conversation that followed was uncomfortable for everyone and necessary for all the same reasons. Cecil was indignant, then ashamed, then belligerent, and then quietly devastated in the way that men who have made catastrophic mistakes sometimes arrive at devastation only after they've exhausted all their other emotions. He had gambling debts beyond the poker game. Ira learned this gradually, over the course of the conversation, debts to men in town, and to a supply company in Carson City, and to a cattle broker named Whitmore who had been patient for longer than his patience was designed to hold. Ira sat at the kitchen table and thought about all of this. He was aware of Augusta standing at the stove with her back to both of them, refilling the coffee pot with the careful, deliberate movements of a person who is maintaining their composure through physical activity. "Here is what I propose," Ira said, and both Donnellys looked at him. "I'll speak to Ambrose Carr about the legal situation with the land. In the meantime, I'll pay Cecil's outstanding debts in town, which I'm told come to approximately $200. He had spent the previous day gathering this information with the quiet efficiency of a man who believes in knowing the full dimensions of a problem before proposing a solution. In exchange, Cecil signs over his 312 acres outright. "The 100 acres of your mother's estate," he said, and now he was addressing Augusta directly, "stays in probate until it's properly settled, at which point it reverts to you as the surviving heir, as it should have done 4 years ago. Cecil keeps a room in the house for as long as he needs it, under the understanding that he doesn't gamble with anything that isn't entirely and legally his to gamble with." There was a long silence. "And what do you get out of this?" Augusta asked. She had turned from the stove and was looking at him with those sharp green eyes that didn't miss anything. 312 acres and a barn in good repair," Ira said, "which is considerably more than I had 2 days ago." "And the house," Cecil said. "The house comes with the land," Ira said, "but I'm not proposing to throw anyone out of it." Cecil Donnelly looked at him for a long, assessing moment. Then he looked at his daughter. Then he looked at his hands on the table, and something in his face went from belligerent to something more honest and considerably less comfortable, like a man meeting his own reflection in a dark window. "All right," he said. It took 3 weeks to settle the legal particulars, 3 weeks during which Ira Donovan slept in the barn and learned the dimensions of the ranch the way he had always learned land, by walking it, early in the mornings before anyone else was up, in the blue-gray light before sunrise when the frost lay in the low hollows and the sage smelled sharp and mineral and real. He learned where the water ran strong and where it was uncertain, which fence lines were solid and which were failing, where the soil was deep enough for a kitchen garden and where it was too rocky for anything but scrub. He also learned Augusta's habits, in the way you learn someone's habits when you live on the same property and aren't trying to intrude on each other's privacy, but keep arriving at the same places at the same times. She was up before dawn every day. She worked with a focused, consistent energy that he recognized as the kind that comes not from enthusiasm, but from deep competence, from knowing exactly what needs to be done and doing it without drama or delay. She spoke to the horses differently than she spoke to people. She read in the evenings, sitting close to the lamp with a book held at the angle of someone with slightly insufficient light and insufficient willingness to acknowledge it. She was not by any measure easy to know. She had the particular reserve of a person who has depended on themselves for long enough that they've forgotten, or perhaps decided not to remember, what it felt like to depend on anyone else. She was courteous to him. She was helpful about the property and the practical matters of the ranch. She did not invite personal conversation, and she did not volunteer personal information beyond what the immediate situation required. He respected this. He also found it, in a way he was not yet prepared to examine closely, quietly extraordinary. The evening the legal papers were finally signed and notarized by Ambrose Carr, who was, as Augusta had accurately assessed, not entirely useless, Ira came in from the barn to find Augusta making supper with the particular focused efficiency she brought to everything, and Cecil sitting at the table looking at the signed documents with an expression that was somewhere between relief and grief. "I'll put the soup on," Augusta said, without turning from the stove. "You might as well stay." He stayed. It was the first time the three of them had eaten a meal together without a legal problem sitting at the table with them, and it was awkward in the way that new arrangements always are, but it was also something, the beginning of a shape, a pattern, a daily life taking form around a set of unexpected circumstances. Cecil Donnelly, it turned out, was better company when he wasn't defending himself. He told stories about the early years of the ranch, when he and Helena had come out from Ohio in 1859 with nothing but 2 horses and a wagon full of optimism, and how Augusta had been born in the house in the summer of 1852. No, wait, 1852 was the year they'd left Ohio. He corrected himself. Augusta had been born in the spring of 1853. Actually, in the first house they'd built before the proper one, which had been more of a large shed. If they were being honest, and Helena had said she'd spent worse nights in Ohio, and Cecil had believed her even though he probably shouldn't have. Augusta, listening to this story with her chin resting on her hand, said, "You've never told it the same way twice," and Cecil said, "Memory is creative, Augusta. It doesn't mean the love wasn't real." And Augusta looked at her soup bowl for a moment before she said very quietly, "No, I know it doesn't." Ira watched this exchange with the attention he brought to things that revealed something true, and he thought about what it must have been like to be this woman growing up on this land, loving it the way she clearly did, watching her father grieve himself into carelessness after her mother died, keeping the books and managing the stock, and holding everything together through the sheer force of her own determined competence, while everything around her slowly, quietly unraveled. He thought about this for a long time after supper, sitting on the porch in the cold October dark, while Columbus shifted in the barn, and the stars came out over the Nevada mountains in their particular brilliant profusion. And he thought that the land was good, and the barn was solid, and the house was real. And all of this was considerably more than he had expected to have when he rode into Cutter's Creek 3 weeks ago with $40 in his coat pocket. He also thought, though he was not yet ready to say it to anyone including himself, that the most extraordinary thing he had encountered since riding through the gate of the Donnelly Ranch was not the land or the barn or the solid stone chimney. It was Augusta. November came in with its cold weight, and Ira began the work of the ranch in earnest, patching fence lines, cleaning out the root cellar, splitting wood for the coming winter with the systematic thoroughness of a man who does not like to be unprepared for predictable things. He hired a hand, a young man named Toby Barnes who was 17 and strong and eager, and together they managed the work of the property with a rhythm that suited both of them. Augusta continued to run the household and the books as she always had, with the addition that she was now occasionally required to discuss the accounts with Ira rather than managing them entirely alone, and these conversations were, at first, businesslike and brief. He asked questions. She answered them. He made suggestions. She agreed or disagreed with clear reasoning. It was professional and efficient and thoroughly unremarkable except for the way neither of them looked at the other directly for very long during these conversations, which was remarkable if you were paying attention. And Toby Barnes, who was 17 and not particularly sophisticated, noticed it within the first week and wisely decided to say nothing. What changed things between them, or rather, what began to change things, because it was a gradual process rather than a single moment, was the horse. There was a mare on the property named Clementine, a gray roan of perhaps 7 years who had been something of a problem for the past season, increasingly difficult to handle, shying from things she had always accepted, losing condition despite adequate feed. Ira noticed this early in November and spent several mornings observing her without intervention, trying to understand what he was looking at. On the 4th morning, Augusta appeared at the fence of the paddock where he was watching Clementine and stood beside him in companionable silence for a few minutes before she said, "Her left rear leg. She had a wire cut last spring. It healed on the surface, but I've been worried it didn't heal all the way through." He looked at the leg. He looked at the way Clementine moved. He said, "You're right." And Augusta said, "I know." And there was something in that exchange, the directness of it, the mutual recognition of something real that was different from their previous conversations in a way that was difficult to articulate but easy to feel. They worked on Clementine together over the following week, treating the leg with the careful patience that horses require. And in those long, quiet mornings in the paddock, something shifted. They began to talk, not about accounts or legal documents or the practical matters of the ranch, but about other things. About the land, about horses, about how Augusta had learned to read from her mother, and had then, having learned it, found she could not stop, and had read everything from seed catalogs to a battered copy of Dickens that a traveling merchant had sold her father for 20 cents in 1865. About how Ira had grown up in Kentucky, the third of 5 children on a farm that was beautiful and poor, and how he had left at 19 not because he was running from anything, but because he had the particular kind of restlessness that is really just a deep need to discover your own dimensions, to find out what you're made of when there's no one around who already thinks they know. He had spent 9 years doing exactly that. He had worked cattle drives in Texas, mended fence in Colorado, spent a winter trapping in Montana that he would not repeat under any circumstances, worked briefly as a deputy in a small New Mexico town, before deciding that wearing a badge suited some men's dispositions better than his. He had accumulated skills and experience and a working understanding of most of the land west of the Mississippi, and he had accumulated almost nothing else, which had suited him until very recently. "Did you ever want to go back to Kentucky?" Augusta asked one morning, currying Clementine while Ira cleaned the wound on her leg with the gentle thoroughness it required. "Not particularly," he said. "My family is still there. We write sometimes, but Kentucky feels like a different life." "I've never left Nevada," Augusta said. "I've never left this valley, really, not for more than a day or two." "Do you want to?" She was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes I want to know what's past the mountains, not permanently, just to know." She looked at him. "Is it worth knowing?" He thought about 9 years of mountains and plains and rivers, and weather and all the different qualities of light in different parts of the country, and he said, "Yes, but it's also worth knowing that you can come back." She looked at him for a moment longer than she usually permitted herself, and then went back to currying the horse. But there was something different in the set of her shoulders after that, something slightly less armored. December brought the first real snow, and with it a kind of enforced closeness that comes when a small number of people share a small number of rooms against the cold. Cecil had settled into a pattern of being moderately useful in the mornings and somewhat useless by evening, which Ira accepted as a fair average, and Augusta accepted as an improvement on previous years. Toby Barnes had gone back to his family for winter and would return in spring. The 3 of them managed the shortened winter days with the mutual accommodation of people who have learned each other's rhythms and adjusted to them without particular ceremony. Ira moved from the barn into the house in December, into the small bedroom at the back that had been used for storage, which Augusta cleared out for him with the practical efficiency that characterized everything she did. And he said thank you. And she said it made no sense to let a man freeze in the barn when there was a room available. And neither of them said anything about what it meant to share a house with someone you were becoming increasingly aware of in ways that went considerably beyond the practical. On the 23rd of December, there was a storm that came down from the mountains with genuine fury and kept everyone inside for 2 solid days. And on the second day of the storm, with the wind driving the snow horizontally past the windows and the house creaking under its pressure, Ira came into the sitting room in the late afternoon to find Augusta reading by the lamp and the fire burning well and the dog asleep in front of it, and Cecil somewhere in the middle of an unplanned nap. And the room was so warm and so still inside all that howling exterior weather that he stopped in the doorway for a moment and simply looked at it. Augusta looked up from her book. "Sit down," she said. "There's nothing else to do." He sat down across from her and picked up the book she had left on the table, a copy of Great Expectations that she had apparently already read twice, based on the penciled marginalia. And they read in companionable silence for 2 hours while the storm did its worst outside. And it was one of the most profoundly comfortable experiences of Ira Donovan's adult life. And he sat with this realization quietly, the way he sat with most things, turning it over in his mind until he understood its shape. He was in love with her. He had been, he suspected, for some time. He did not say anything about this. He was not a man who said things until he was prepared to mean them absolutely. And he needed to think carefully about what it would mean to say such a thing to a woman who had every reason to be suspicious of his motivations, and whose life had been seriously disrupted by his arrival, however unintentionally. He also needed to think about whether he was the kind of man she could trust, and whether he had demonstrated that sufficiently, and whether she felt anything at all in return beyond the cautious professional regard she had offered him since October. He thought about all of this with great care over the following weeks, while the winter held its ground and the days were short, and the three of them moved through the house and the barn and the limited circle of activities the cold permitted. And what he concluded, after all this thinking, was that he was not going to know whether she felt anything until he said something. And that saying something required a degree of courage that was different from the physical courage he had exercised in various difficult situations over the years, and was in some ways considerably harder. He said something in late January. It happened in the kitchen, which is where most honest things happen when the world is too cold to be outside. And it happened because Augusta had burned her hand on the stove. Not badly, not seriously. Just a quick, sharp contact with a pan handle she had not protected properly. And he had taken her hand without thinking and held it under cold water from the pump, and then held it in both of his for a moment afterward in the careful, focused way of someone checking whether the burn was serious. And then stood there holding her hand well past the point where checking was the explanation. She looked at their joined hands. She looked up at him. "Augusta," he said. "Yes," she said. "I need to say something, and I would rather say it plainly than go around it." "I would prefer that also," she said. He took a breath. He was still holding her hand. "I am aware that the way I came to be on this property is not the most ordinary beginning anyone has ever had. And I know that I have been, through no particular fault of my own, a significant disruption to your life. And I know that you had no choice about any of the circumstances that led us to be standing in this kitchen right now." "That's all true," she said. "But I also know," he continued, "that I have spent 4 months in close proximity to you, and that in those 4 months I have not once wished I were anywhere else, which is, for a man who spent 9 years never staying anywhere for longer than a season, fairly significant information." She was very still. The pump dripped. The stove clicked. "I'm not asking you for anything you're not prepared to give," he said. "I'm just telling you the truth because you seem to prefer it." "I do prefer it," she said, "very much." She looked at him steadily for a long moment with those green eyes that never gave anything away until they gave everything away, and then she said, "I have been trying for 4 months not to think about you in ways that seemed impractical." "And," he said, "and I have been completely unsuccessful," she said. He was a man of considered action, not impulsive action, and so he did not do anything dramatic. He simply held her hand a little more firmly and said, "Then perhaps we could stop trying to be impractical about it." And she said, "Perhaps." And they stood there in the January kitchen with the cold pressing at the windows and the stove ticking, and the enormity of what they had just said to each other settling around them like snow, quietly, completely, covering everything. They did not rush. This was partly temperament. Both of them were people who proceeded carefully through significant terrain, and partly the understanding that the circumstances of their meeting required an extra layer of honesty about what they wanted, so that neither of them could later wonder whether they had simply fallen into proximity rather than into genuine choice. So they talked. More than Ira had talked to anyone in his adult life, and more than Augusta had permitted herself to talk to any person who was not a book. They talked in the evenings after Cecil had gone to bed, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the house settling around them in the cold. And what came out of these conversations was a picture of two people who had, by completely different routes, arrived at the same place. Cautious, self-sufficient, more capable than they had been given credit for, hungry for something real. He told her about Kentucky, and about his mother's hands always smelling of bread, and about the particular beauty of a spring morning in the bluegrass country that he had missed without realizing it for years. She told him about her mother, Helena, who had been practical and warm and fierce and funny, who had taught Augusta to read and to make pastry, and to never let anyone convince her that her opinions were less valuable than theirs, because she was a woman and who had died of a fever in the spring of 1872, and left a hole in the fabric of everything that Cecil had dealt with by drinking and Augusta had dealt with by working until she was too tired to feel it. She told him that she had dreamed, when she was younger, of going to San Francisco. Not to live necessarily, just to see it, the bay, the ships, the hills, the impossible concentrated civilization of a real city after a life spent in this beautiful, remote valley. He said, "We could go." She looked at him across the lamp. "Could we?" "In the spring, when the passes open. It's a reasonable journey, 2 weeks, perhaps 3. Cecil is managing better than he was. This was true. The absence of significant gambling money and the presence of someone who expected things of him had had a moderately steadying effect on Cecil Donnelly, who had not been to the Silver Spur since November and who had begun, in small ways, to take an interest in the ranch again. Toby will be back by then. The ranch can be managed. She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her doing what she always did with anything that seemed too good, examining it for the catch, the flaw, the hidden cost. "You'd take me to San Francisco," she said. "If you'd like to go," he said. "I am not a man who makes plans for other people without asking." She looked at him with those green eyes in the lamplight, and then she did something she almost never did, which was to smile without reservation. Not the small, controlled curve she allowed herself in ordinary circumstances, but a real, full smile that transformed her whole face into something Ira Donovan thought he could look at for the rest of his natural life without it becoming ordinary. "I'd like to go," she said. February passed in the slow, golden way of winter months that are cold but no longer hostile, when the worst of the season has been weathered, and spring begins to exist as a reasonable future rather than a distant rumor. Ira and Augusta fell into a rhythm that was part professional partnership and part something considerably warmer, and this suited both of them in the way that suits people who are most themselves when they are also being useful. Cecil noticed. He said nothing about it for several weeks, with the particular tact of a man who knows he does not have the moral authority to have opinions about other people's choices. And then one Sunday morning in February, when Augusta was outside and Ira was drinking his coffee at the kitchen table, Cecil sat down across from him and said, without preamble, "What are your intentions toward my daughter?" Ira put down his coffee cup. "Honorable," he said. Cecil looked at him for a long moment. He was a man who had been many things, not all of them admirable, but he had loved his wife with genuine devotion, and he loved his daughter with the particular anguished love of someone who knows they have not been adequate to the task, but feels it deeply nonetheless. "She has held this family together for 4 years, Cecil said. "She has held this ranch together and this family together, and she has done it mostly alone, and she deserves—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "She deserves considerably better than what she's had. I know it, Ira said. Cecil looked at him for another moment. "Are you a man who stays?" he asked. Ira thought about 9 years of not staying. He thought about Columbus in the barn and $40 in his coat pocket, and the night he had won a card game and ridden out in the morning not knowing what he would find. He thought about 4 months of walking this land in the early mornings and cooking eggs in this kitchen, and reading across the lamp from a woman with red hair and green eyes who preferred honesty to comfort. "I am now," he said. Cecil nodded once and picked up his coffee and said nothing more about it, which was, from Cecil Donnelly, something approximating a blessing. On the 1st of March, when the snow was thinning in the lower pastures and the creek had begun to run again in earnest, Ira asked Augusta to walk with him. She put on her coat and her hat and her good boots, and they walked north across the property to the high point of the land, a low ridge that looked out over the valley in 3 directions, where the light in the late afternoon was the particular gold of a Nevada winter releasing its grip. He told her that he intended to stay. Not as a tenant on the land, not as the man who had won it in a card game, but as a man who had chosen it, chosen this specific piece of the earth on this specific hill in this specific valley, for reasons that had started as practical and had become something considerably more essential. Then he told her that he had chosen her with equal deliberateness, and that if she felt the same way he did, he would like to marry her, not because it was convenient or because the circumstances of their meeting made it logical, but because 4 months ago he had ridden through a gate with $40 and a horse and no plan, and in the months since, she had become his plan, the most compelling one he had ever made, the only one that felt in his bones like the right direction. Augusta Donnelly stood on the ridge in the March light and listened to all of this with the careful attention she gave to things that mattered, and when he was done she said, "I want to make sure you understand that I am not a woman who will be managed." "I know it," he said. "I'll have opinions about the ranch and about money and about decisions, and I will not be told that my opinions are unwelcome because they are inconvenient. I would expect nothing less," he said. "And I want to go to San Francisco," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that was about more than the city, that was about all the unlived portions of herself, the things she had put aside to keep the ranch going and the family functioning and the accounts balanced, the parts of Augusta Donnelly that had not yet had room to exist. "We'll go," he said. She looked at him for a long moment with the late afternoon light on her face and the valley spread below them in every direction, and she said, "Yes, then. Yes, I'll marry you." He took her hands, both of them, the way he had taken her burned hand in the kitchen in January, with the careful, thorough attention of someone who holds things that matter, and there, on the ridge with the wind moving through the sage and the creek audible below them, and the Nevada mountains standing in their ancient, patient circuit around the valley. It seemed to Ira Donovan that he had arrived, finally and completely, at the life he was supposed to be living. They were married in April in the sitting room of the ranch house by a minister named Reverend Hollies, who came out from Cutter's Creek in a buckboard with his Bible and his good suit, and who performed the ceremony with the quiet dignity it deserved, while Cecil Donnelly sat in his chair by the fire with his hands folded and his eyes bright, and Toby Barnes stood in the doorway in a clean shirt looking extremely earnest. And the dog sat between them all with the serene confidence of a creature that knows a good thing when it sees it. Augusta wore her mother's good dress, which she had altered to fit herself, a deep green that made her eyes remarkable and her hair more vivid than usual. And she said her vows with the steady clarity of a woman who means absolutely every word she says. And Ira said his with the quiet certainty of a man who has thought very carefully about what he is promising and is at peace with all of it. After the ceremony, Augusta made a dinner that was better than the occasion strictly required, because she did everything with thoroughness, and Cecil opened a bottle of whiskey he had been keeping for something worthy, and they sat at the kitchen table and ate and talked, and the house was full of something it had not been full of in a long time, which was uncomplicated happiness, and none of them said anything about it directly because some things are too true to need commentary. They went to San Francisco in May. It was a journey of 9 days out, traveling by stage to Sacramento and then by train. The Transcontinental Railroad had been operating since 1869, and Augusta, who had read about it extensively but never traveled it, sat by the window for the entire passage through the Sierra Nevada with an expression of such undisguised wonder that Ira spent as much time watching her as watching the mountains, which were, as mountains go, genuinely spectacular. San Francisco in 1877 was everything Augusta had imagined, and a number of things she hadn't. It was loud and layered and improbable. The hills stacked with buildings that seemed to argue with gravity, the bay stretching away silver gray in the fog, the streets full of people from everywhere on earth pursuing their various ambitions with the particular energy of a city that had been built entirely out of forward momentum. She stood on the waterfront on the second day and looked at the ships and the bay and the Marin headlands across the water, and she said, "Oh," very quietly, and Ira stood beside her and didn't say anything, because it was one of those moments that doesn't need language. They spent 10 days in the city, and Augusta accumulated experiences with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything. The museums, the markets, a theater performance of Shakespeare that she watched with total absorption, and then discussed with him for 2 days afterward. The Chinese Quarter, which was extraordinary, and which they navigated with the careful awareness that the city, for all its vitality, carried within it the same injustices that the rest of the country did. The same hierarchies and exclusions, the same willingness to accept the labor of people it was not prepared to treat as equals. Augusta had opinions about this, which she expressed directly, and Ira had the same opinions, and they talked about it with the honest, clear-eyed attention of people who know that saying a thing plainly is at least more honest than not saying it. She bought books. A great many books, which had to be shipped back to Nevada in a crate because there was no possible way to carry them on the return journey, and Ira helped her pack the crate and did not say a word about the quantity, except to note that the crate was very well constructed and ought to survive the freight journey intact, which made her laugh in the way she laughed when she was genuinely pleased. Not the polite laugh, which was brief and controlled, but the real one, which was fuller and warmer, and which he had decided early on was one of the best sounds he had ever heard. The return journey was 9 days through the warming May landscape, and by the time they came back to the ranch in early June, the valley was green with the brief, brilliant Nevada spring, and the creek was running full, and the cattle were in the north pasture looking well, and Toby had managed everything in their absence with a competence that justified the wage increase Ira had given him before leaving. Cecil Donnelly had, in their absence, done something unexpected. He had been to see Ambrose Carr about the outstanding debt to the cattle broker Whitmore, and had negotiated a payment schedule using his own saved money. He had apparently been accumulating quietly for several months from small jobs in town, because he was, it turned out, not entirely without the capacity to make amends when he decided it was worth making them. He presented this information to Augusta on the evening of their return with the awkward, hopeful solemnity of a man offering something inadequate but genuine. Augusta looked at the payment schedule and looked at her father and said, "Thank you, Papa." Then she hugged him briefly, with the particular care of someone who loves someone complicated, and Cecil put his arms around her and held on for a moment with his eyes closed, and Ira found a reason to go check on the horses. Summer on the ranch was different from winter and spring, bigger, louder, with more moving parts and more demands, and the particular urgency of land that has a limited warm season in which to accomplish everything it needs to. Ira was outside from first light, and Augusta worked alongside him more hours than not, because the books and the household were a morning's worth of work, and the land was an all-day commitment, and she had not spent 24 years on this property to become an indoor person now that there was someone else doing the outdoor labor. They worked well together. This was not a given. Working alongside someone you love is its own kind of test, because love doesn't make people's different approaches to problems suddenly identical. And there were mornings when Augusta's certainty about how something should be done and Ira's certainty about how something should be done occupied the same space with an energy that was not quite argument, but was clearly not agreement either. They learned, through the summer, how to navigate this, when to defer, when to hold the ground, when the most useful thing was to try both approaches and see which one actually worked. More often than not, the answer was some combination of both, which neither of them ever said out loud because there is such a thing as too much self-awareness about being right together. In August, Augusta told Ira she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen, early on a Wednesday morning, with the same directness she brought to all significant information, and he set down his coffee cup and looked at her and said nothing for a full 10 seconds, which was unlike him, and then he said, "Are you well?" "How do you feel?" "I feel fine," she said. "I am perfectly healthy. Babies are not an illness." "I know it," he said. Then he stood up from the table and crossed to where she was standing and held her face in both hands and looked at her the way he always looked at things that mattered to him, with the full, unhurried attention of a man who knows the value of what he is looking at. "I am very glad," he said. "So am I," she said. "Surprisingly so, actually. I wasn't sure how I would feel." "And you feel glad?" "Profoundly," she said. He kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and then stood holding her in the August kitchen for a while. And she let herself be held in the way she was gradually learning to let herself be held, not reluctantly, not with the part of herself that was always calculating the cost of needing someone, but fully, with the trust that he had spent the better part of a year earning. Cecil Donnelly, upon being told, went immediately to town and came back with a bottle of good wine and a length of yellow ribbon, which he couldn't entirely explain the purpose of, but which had seemed, in the store, like the right kind of thing to purchase. Augusta accepted both with genuine warmth. Toby Barnes said, "Congratulations, ma'am," about 6 times in succession, and then turned red and went back to work. The baby came in the spring, March 1878, a month that Ira would always associate afterward with the particular quality of Nevada light, when winter is genuinely releasing rather than just pausing, when you can feel the warmth beginning to accumulate in the stones and the soil and the south-facing slopes of the hills. The baby was a boy. They named him Henry, for Ira's father, with the middle name Cecil, which Cecil Donnelly did not expect, and which appeared to affect him considerably more than he was prepared for, which Augusta had anticipated, because she knew her father well enough to know that the things that hit him hardest were always the ones that came from kindness rather than criticism. Henry Donnelly Donovan was, from his first moments, a large and vigorous opinion about everything. He had Ira's dark hair and Augusta's green eyes, and the particular quality of attention that both of them shared, the way of looking at things with complete focus, as if they were going to remember it, and he became, very quickly, the center around which the household's daily life reorganized itself in the way that babies cause reorganization. The ranch continued. The cattle were sold well that autumn. The probate on Helena Donnelly's 100 acres was formally resolved in the fall of 1878, 3 years after it had been opened, and more than 6 years after Helena's death. And the land was formally titled to Augusta Donovan, which she accepted with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has waited for something just long enough to fully appreciate it when it arrives. She walked the boundary of her 100 acres the day after the papers came through, in the October light with Henry on her hip, because he was 7 months old and thoroughly mobile in spirit if not yet in body, and she walked every fence line and every creek edge and every pasture corner, and she said to him, because she said most things she thought to Henry even though he did not yet understand words, "This is yours too when you're old enough. This particular piece of the earth. Do not gamble it away." Henry regarded her with his father's dark, attentive eyes and reached for a strand of her hair, which he found much more immediately interesting than land ownership, and she kissed the top of his head and walked on. The following spring brought Toby Barnes a wife, a girl named Mary from a family who had settled 12 miles north, and whom Toby had apparently been corresponding with for the better part of a year with a secretive dedication that delighted Augusta when she found out about it. Mary Barnes was a small, decisive person with brown eyes and strong opinions, and she and Augusta became friends with the easy efficiency of two people who recognize something essential in each other immediately. It was Mary who convinced Augusta in the summer of 1879 that the valley needed a school. There were 18 children within riding distance of Cutter's Creek who were getting no formal education, a situation that Augusta had been aware of and disturbed by since before Ira's arrival, and that Mary had also found impossible to accept. The two of them began a campaign, which started with a meeting in the Donovan kitchen and expanded outward into the town and the surrounding ranches, and which required considerably more sustained argument than either of them had anticipated, because there is always someone who will tell you that children can learn what they need to know from their parents, and that building a school is an unnecessary expense. Augusta was prepared for this argument and had, in fact, been preparing for it in some form her entire life, because she was a woman who had educated herself from borrowed books and determination, and knew exactly what that cost and what it was worth, and she said so with such clarity and such specific detail that opposition generally found itself outflanked. Ira donated the lumber. Several other ranchers donated labor and materials. Ambrose Carr turned out to have a cousin in Carson City who was a qualified teacher and who had been looking for a position in a place where she might be of genuine use, and who arrived in the fall of 1879 on the stage from Sacramento with a trunk full of books and the look of a person who has found exactly the right place. The school opened in October 1879 in a building that smelled of fresh lumber and chalk and the particular excited nervousness of children in a new place, and Augusta stood in the doorway on the first morning and watched 18 children settle into their seats and thought of her mother, who had taught her to read on winter mornings in a house that had since been replaced by the bigger one, on a property that had since been won in a card game and reorganized around a set of entirely unexpected relationships, and she thought that some things, if you let them, move toward their right shape eventually. Cecil Donnelly died in the winter of 1880. It was not unexpected. He had been declining for 2 years, and the doctor in Cutter's Creek had been honest about what he saw when he listened to Cecil's heart. He died on a Sunday in February, quietly in his room, which was the room that had been his since Helena died, and which he had made no significant attempt to improve or decorate, but which Augusta had kept clean and warm, and supplied with the small comforts she knew he appreciated without ever making a particular point of it. He had, in the last year of his life, become genuinely useful on the ranch in the way that men sometimes discover they can be, when they stop fighting against the shape their life has taken and simply inhabit it. He had taught Henry, who was not quite 2, to make the particular clicking sound that made the horses come, and had spent more afternoons in the barn talking to Columbus than either Ira or Augusta knew, and had, on at least 2 occasions that Toby witnessed, sat on the porch in the evening light with a glass of water, not whiskey, water, and watched the sun go down over the valley with the expression of a man who is trying to memorize something. He left a letter, which Augusta found on his nightstand, addressed to my daughter, which was how he had signed it as well, and which contained 14 lines of small, careful handwriting that said, among other things, that he knew he had failed her in more ways than she had ever said, and that he knew she had held the family together when he had not been capable of holding anything, and that the best thing he had done in his life was her mother, and the second best thing was Augusta herself, and that he hoped she knew he meant it even when he had been unable to say it. He had ended with, "Donovan is a good man. I know it. I knew it the night I lost the card game, if I'm being honest, which I am trying to be, finally. Take care of the land. It loved your mother, and I believe it loves you." Augusta read this letter once, sitting alone in her room in the early morning before Henry woke, and then folded it carefully and put it in the box where she kept her mother's wedding ring and the photograph of the two of them from 1860, which was the only photograph of her mother she had. She went downstairs and made the coffee, and when Ira came into the kitchen, she handed him his cup, and he saw her face and didn't ask, because he knew her well enough by now not to fill a silence that needed to remain one, and he just put his hand on her back for a moment, steady and warm, and she leaned into it the way she had learned to lean into things that would hold her. The funeral was small, because Cecil had not had many friends at the end, but the people who came were genuine, and the Reverend Holly said kind things that were also true, which is a combination rarer than it should be. They buried Cecil Donnelly on the east side of the property, under a juniper tree that was old enough to have been there when he and Helena had arrived in the valley in 1859, and Augusta put wild flowers on the grave because it was February, and there weren't many options, but she had found some, because she always found what was needed when she set her mind to looking. Afterward, standing at the graveside in the pale winter light with Henry on Ira's arm and Toby and Mary Barnes a respectful distance away, Augusta said, "He was better at the end than he was in the middle. I think that ought to count for something." Ira said, "I think it counts for a great deal." She looked at the grave for a moment and then looked at the valley and then looked at her husband and her son and said, "Let's go in. Henry is cold." Henry was not noticeably cold, being warmly wrapped and thoroughly preoccupied with trying to remove Ira's hat, but they went in, and the house was warm and the coffee was still on, and Mary Barnes had, in the way of women who express care through food, produced an enormous and entirely unnecessary amount of pie, which turned out to be exactly the right thing. Life settled into its new shape, as life does. The ranch grew not dramatically, not with the ambition of men who want empires, but steadily, in the way of people who are building something meant to last. They bought the 30 acres adjacent to the north pasture in 1881, which gave them better access to the creek in summer. Ira added a proper study to the house for Augusta's books, which had continued to arrive in crates from San Francisco because she had found a bookseller there who sent her catalogs and whose taste she had come to trust. Henry grew into a boy who was, as advertised by his infant self, a thorough and vigorous opinion about everything, but who also had his father's habit of careful attention and his mother's habit of reading, and who by the age of 5 had strong views about horses and mathematics and the unfairness of bedtimes, which he expressed clearly and without apparent self-consciousness. In the spring of 1882, Augusta told Ira she was pregnant again. She told him at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where she had told him the first time, in the same direct way, and he set down his coffee cup in the same way, and she said, "You do that every time," and he said, "I expect it will always require a moment," and she said, "Fair enough." This baby came in October, a second son. They named him James, for no particular reason except that they had said the name in the evening, and looked at the baby and both felt it was right, which is as good a reason as any. James was smaller and quieter than Henry had been, with his mother's red hair and Ira's deliberate, watchful quality, and from very early it was clear that these two boys were going to be extremely different people who were going to find each other both confusing and entirely necessary. The school continued to serve the valley's children. Miss Geraldine Carr, the teacher, had been a permanent fixture since 1879 and had by now taught nearly 30 children to read and cipher and argue with evidence, which Augusta considered the most important part of a proper education. The school board met twice a year in the Donovan kitchen, which had become, over time, the room in which most things of community importance in that corner of the valley were decided, partly because it was central and large, and partly because Augusta kept very good coffee. In the evenings, after the boys were in bed and the house was quiet, Ira and Augusta sat in the sitting room the way they had always sat in winter, him with the current task, a book or the accounts or a piece of tack in need of repair, her with her reading, close to the lamp. The dog had died the previous spring and been replaced by another dog, smaller and more excitable, who slept at Augusta's feet with the devoted abandon of a creature that has found its person. Sometimes they talked. About the ranch, about the boys, about what they'd read, about the news from the wider world that came in the papers from Carson City, and occasionally from the San Francisco papers that arrived 3 days late but were worth the wait. The country was changing around them. The Indian Wars had their terrible continuation. Land was being claimed and fenced and fought over in ways that displaced people who had been there long before any of this. And the railroad was pushing into corners of the West that had previously been beyond its reach, bringing change of every kind, not all of it kind. They talked about these things with the honesty that had always characterized their conversations, without pretending the world was simpler than it was. Sometimes they sat quietly. He had always loved the quiet of the house, the particular settled quality of a place that has been inhabited long enough to have its own sound, its own breathing in the dark. He loved this house the way he loved the land, not with the possessive love of someone who has acquired something, but with the grateful love of someone who has been accepted by something. He loved Augusta with a depth that had only grown with time and proximity, and the daily accumulation of knowing someone truly, knowing how she took her coffee, and how she moved through the barn in the morning, and what her face looked like when she was trying not to laugh, and what it looked like when she was genuinely worried about something, and how she held the boys when they were sick, with the same fierce, focused tenderness she brought to everything that mattered to her. One evening in the fall of 1883, 7 years nearly after the card game that had started everything, Ira was sitting on the porch in the last of the evening light when Augusta came out and sat beside him in the other chair. They had 2 chairs on the porch now, a deliberate improvement over the early days when there had been one, and they sat in them frequently in the warm months, watching the light change over the valley. "I was thinking about something," Augusta said. "Tell me," he said. "I was thinking about the night you rode up to the gate with the deed in your pocket." She looked out at the valley, which was gold and amber and deep blue in the fading light. "And about how angry I was." "You were very controlled about it," he said. "I was furious," she said. "I thought you were going to be like every other man who had ever decided that something belonging to a woman was actually his to take." "Were there many of those?" "Enough," she said. "The wool merchant in town who shorted my count 3 years running, the banker in Carson City who spoke to my father about my mother's estate instead of speaking to me, various other examples." He said nothing. "There was nothing to say to this that wasn't obvious. And then you showed me the deed," she continued, "and I told you about the probate and you just looked at the document. And you said you'd speak to a lawyer." She paused. "You didn't argue with me. You didn't tell me I was wrong. You just accepted that there was information you didn't have yet and went to get it." "It seemed like the reasonable response," he said. "It was a remarkable response," she said. "I wasn't expecting it." He looked at her in the evening light, this woman who had become the architecture of his life, the essential structure around which everything else made sense. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "People have said to me, over the years, people in town, Hector Beale at the poker table the night it happened, the men in the saloon, that I won the Donnelly ranch in a card game, as though that is the remarkable thing. The land." He paused. "But the land is good land and I am grateful for it. The land is not the remarkable thing." Augusta looked at him with those green eyes in the fading light. "You are the remarkable thing," he said. "You are the best prize, Augusta. The land came with you, but I would have said the other way around, that you came with the land, and it made winning the land the luckiest thing that ever happened to me. And that was true the first morning I rode up to that gate and you were standing there with 2 buckets of water and a look that would have stopped a lesser man entirely." Augusta was quiet for a moment. "It didn't stop you," she said. "No," he said. "It convinced me you were someone worth knowing." She looked at him for a long time in the Nevada evening, with the valley darkening below them and the first stars appearing over the mountains and the distant sound of Henry, inside, apparently engaged in some kind of vigorous argument with his younger brother about the ownership of something, and the newer dog barking at something in the middle distance. "I love you, Ira Donovan," she said. It was not the first time she had said it, but she said it with the same directness and weight she gave to all the true things, with no hedging and no diminishment and the full measure of what she meant. "I love you, Augusta Donnelly Donovan," he said, "considerably more than I love the land, for whatever that is worth." "It's worth a great deal," she said, and reached across and took his hand, and they sat on the porch while the evening came all the way in and the stars took full possession of the sky. The years that followed were good years, not without difficulty, because no years are, and not without the ordinary sorrows and challenges of a life fully inhabited, but good in the essential way, the way that means something real when you say it. In 1885, Augusta had a daughter, their third child, who they named Helena for Augusta's mother, and who arrived in the world with her father's dark eyes and her grandmother's quality of warmth and was, from the start, completely unafraid of anything, which should perhaps not have surprised anyone. Henry, who was 7, received his sister with a solemnity that lasted approximately one afternoon before dissolving into the particular chaos of a household with 3 children and 2 dogs, and a ranch full of things to investigate. James, at 3, was primarily interested in the daughter's fingers, which he studied with the careful attention of a natural scientist. The ranch flourished. The valley community grew into something more intentional over those years, not just a collection of people near the same creek, but a community that had a school and a pattern of helping each other and a shared sense of what mattered. There were still the injustices that the territory brought with it, the treatment of Chinese workers and native families, the grinding poverty that came for some families regardless of their effort, the way certain lives were made harder by systems that had decided those lives mattered less. Augusta sat on the school board and argued consistently that every child within distance deserved a seat in the schoolroom. She argued this with the same clear, evidenced persistence she had brought to every important disagreement in her life, and she won some of these arguments and lost some, but she never stopped making them. Ira backed her in this, publicly and privately, because it was the right thing to do and because he had never been a man who confused the comfort of silence with the virtue of it. Henry Donovan, grown to 15 by 1893, had his father's dark hair and his mother's way of moving through the world with total, focused attention, and had developed an alarming gift for mathematics that Augusta was cultivating with a combination of books and correspondence with a professor at the University of Nevada, which had opened in Reno in 1874, and was, in her opinion, the best news the territory had received since statehood. She intended Henry to attend if he wished to, and she was fairly certain he wished to, although Henry at 15 was still primarily occupied with the question of whether he could train the younger of the 2 horses to jump the back fence, a project in which he was making progress. James, at 13, was quieter and more focused than his brother, already helping Ira with the accounts with a precision that made Ira think he might have found the person who could eventually take over the ranch's finances entirely, which thought he kept to himself, because James was 13, and also because Augusta would have had a thorough opinion about the appropriate timeline for such things. Helena at 8 was reading at a level that staggered the teacher at the school, who had written to Augusta to say so, and who had also noted in the same letter that Helena had corrected her geography twice in 1 week and done so with such cheerful confidence that it was impossible to be offended. Augusta had read this letter to Ira with considerable satisfaction. He had said, "I wonder where she gets that," with a straight face, and Augusta had thrown the letter at him, and he had caught it. One evening in the late summer of 1895, nearly 2 decades after Ira had ridden through the gate with the deed in his pocket, He sat on the porch in the same chair and looked out at the same valley and thought about the particular shape of a life. The land was good. He had walked every acre of it in every season for 19 years, and it was as known to him as anything he had ever known. The way it held the morning light, the places where the grass grew long in wet years and short in dry ones, the south-facing slope where the soil was deepest and warmest, the north fence line where the juniper stood thick and dark and old. He had spent the better part of 2 decades learning this land, and it had spent the same time learning him, which is how it is between a person and a place when the relationship is genuine. Augusta came out and sat beside him, as she had done 10,000 evenings, or near enough, and she had brought 2 cups of coffee and handed him his without asking how he liked it, which had not been necessary for approximately 18 years. She looked different and the same, the way people do when you know them truly. The red in her hair had silver in it now, and there were lines at the corners of her eyes, and she moved with the ease of a person who has spent decades becoming more fully herself, more settled in her dimensions, more certain of what mattered and untroubled by what didn't. She was, in his opinion, more beautiful than she had been the morning he first saw her at the gate. He had told her this, and she had said that was biologically implausible, and he had said that biology was not the relevant framework, and she had considered this, and allowed that he might have a point. Henry had left for Reno in September of 1893 to attend the university, and was doing excellently, and sending long, digressive letters full of mathematical observations, and more recently, references to a young woman named Caroline who appeared in the letters with increasing frequency and decreasing pretense of being casually mentioned. Augusta had read these letters to Ira with the particular smile of a woman who recognizes exactly what is happening. James, at 20, was managing the ranch's finances with a thoroughness that had made their relationship with the bank in Carson City considerably more structured and favorable. He was also, with characteristic quietness, corresponding with a woman from the Barnes family, not Mary's daughter, but a niece who had come out to visit the previous summer and had apparently made a considerable impression on James in the 7 days she was there, because James had not stopped writing to her since. Helena was 12 and ferocious and read everything she could find and had already, on 3 separate occasions, argued Augusta to a draw on subjects where Augusta had expected to have the decisive advantage, and Augusta was, privately, extraordinarily proud. "What are you thinking?" Augusta asked. "That the land is good," Ira said. "It is," she agreed. "And that I am a very fortunate man." "You are," she said, with the particular warmth she had when she was agreeing with something true and wanted to be sure it was heard. "And you made it so. You made a place that was falling apart into one that is standing up." "We did," he said. She looked at him. "Yes, we." He looked out at the valley in the summer evening and thought about $40 and a horse named Columbus and a card game and a woman at a gate with mud on her boots and the full 18 years of everything that had followed. And he thought that there was not, in any of it, a single day he would choose to have lived differently. "I want to go to San Francisco again," Augusta said. He looked at her. "When?" "This winter, just the 2 of us. The boys can manage. Helena can go to Mary's." She had the particular light in her eyes that had been there the first time she had agreed to go, the light of someone allowing themselves something that has been wanted for a long time. "I want to see it again. I've read so much about how it's changed." "Then we'll go," he said, the same words he had said 18 years ago with the same certainty because it was the same truth. Wherever Augusta Donnelly wanted to go, he intended to take her. She smiled the real smile, the one that transformed everything. "Good." They sat on the porch while the evening completed itself, while the valley went from amber to gray to dark, while the mountains stood in their patient circuit and the creek ran below them, and the house behind them breathed with the quiet, warm presence of a well-inhabited place. Somewhere inside, Helena was reading, and a lamp was lit, and the second dog, the third dog now, actually, the second having died in 1890, was presumably asleep somewhere inadvisable. This was the life. Not dramatic, not the stuff of legend, but solid and warm and real and chosen, every single day, by two people who had arrived at each other by the most unlikely route, and had made of that unlikely beginning something lasting and good. Augusta leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, a gesture so habitual and so essential that neither of them marked it consciously anymore. It had simply become part of the texture of the evening, the way the coffee and the chair and the valley view were part of it. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" she said. "Tell me," he said. "I think about the morning you rode up to the gate, the way you took off your hat." She paused. "Even angry as I was, I noticed that you took off your hat." He was quiet for a moment. "I was trying not to seem threatening." "I know," she said, "but it was the right thing. It was the thing that made me think you might be reasonable." She was quiet. "And then you read the probate document and you didn't argue." "It was a clear legal situation," he said. "It was," she said, "but you didn't know that until you read it. You were prepared to be wrong." That was not what I expected." "What did you expect?" She thought about it. "Someone who thought that winning the hand meant he had won everything. Someone who would stand in front of my house with a document and expect me to simply step aside." "I've never expected you to step aside from anything," he said. "It would be like expecting a mountain to step aside." "That's not a particularly romantic image," she said. "It is from where I'm standing," he said. "I happen to find mountains remarkable." She looked at him with the warmth she saved for the moments when he said something that cut past all the ordinary surfaces to something real. "Ira," she said. "Augusta," he said. "I'm very glad you won that card game." He turned to look at her fully, this woman, his wife, the center of a life that was everything he had not known he wanted when he rode into Cutter's Creek in the autumn of 1876 with $40 and no plan. "So am I," he said. "More than anything I have ever been glad of." The stars came out over the Nevada mountains, the same stars that had been there when Cecil Donnelly had sat at a poker table with a whiskey glass and a desperate idea. The same stars that had been there when Ira had ridden through the gate the next morning not knowing what he would find. And the same stars that had been there for Helena Donnelly and the house she had loved, and the land she had helped build, and the daughter she had left behind to carry it all forward. The creek ran. The horses were quiet in the barn. Inside the house, a lamp burned and a child read and the dog shifted in its sleep. And on the porch, in two chairs that had been placed there together deliberately and remained there every summer since, Ira Donovan and Augusta Donnelly sat with their coffee and their long shared knowledge of each other. And the evening held them both, and it was enough, and it was everything, and it was the life they had made from an unlikely beginning and a card game and a woman at a gate who had looked at a stranger with mud on her boots and the courage to demand he say the truth. He had said it then. He said it now in the language of a hand on hers, a shared warmth in the cooling evening, a life that had been built day by careful day into something neither of them had known to wish for until they had it. The land was good. The house was warm. And Augusta Donnelly Donovan, reading to her daughter by the lamp inside and dreaming of San Francisco and watching her sons become the men she had believed they could be, was the very best thing that had ever found its way into Ira Donovan's particular and fortunate life. He had won the land in a card game. She had come with it. And every single day since, he had known without question which was the better prize.